broadcast everything. There's that one. All right, I believe we are live and going everywhere we should be. Appreciate everyone for joining us here tonight. Let me get back here and share a big screen. As I said earlier, we're in Exodus 19 tonight. We'll be continuing our study of this book. Matter of fact, we're getting into an interesting point in the book, in that we are getting to where we're going to begin to see the people of Israel at Sinai. And so that's what we're going to see here in just a second. Once I get everything, make sure I've got everything where it needed to be here. All right, I believe that's everything we got. All right, so you remember last week we talked about Exodus 18. We talked about Moses and the workload he sort of put on himself, where he was judging all of Israel. And remember how Jethro, his father-in-law, come to him and tell him he's doing too much work, that he needed to divide it up. And we talked about that he made what we basically would call upper courts and lower courts, that Moses would take part of the cases, and he would take the major cases, that he would designate some of the smaller squabbles and smaller problems to these other judges to take care of, so Moses could lead the people. Remember, Moses enacts that, and again, we assume that God told Moses to do that as well, or gave God's approval, because that is the system that later on in the book of Exodus and in the book of maybe Leviticus and Deuteronomy, before we actually see it, that's the case, that's a system that God puts into place. Now, we talked about there that they were in Rephidim, which is right near the Mount Sinai. It is in the mountain range of Horeb. And so we're getting closer, and that leads us into tonight, into where they're actually at, because when we get to Exodus 19, look at the first 3 verses, we see Israel mentioned of where they are. Notice verse 1, on the 3rd new moon, after the people of Israel had gone out of the land of Egypt, on that day they came into the wilderness of Sinai. They set out from Rephidim and came into the wilderness of Sinai, and they encamped in the wilderness. There Israel encamped before the mountain, while Moses went up to God. The Lord called to him out of the mountain, saying, "Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, and tell the people of Israel, you yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples, for all the earth is mine. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the people of Israel." Now, we'll go back and talk about this, and we'll see this interaction as we progress to this chapter. We're told here in verse 1, the 3rd new moon, that this is something interesting that I always found interesting, this one, in that this is the way the Jews kept counting. It says interesting because this year Elizabeth has found her a calendar that has the different phases of the moon, and so she'll talk about the phases of the moon and how she's looked at the different ones we've had so far, and she asked about it, about why it does that. And I find it interesting because here you have Israel. You see their system, that they are their calendar, reason we always talk about their calendar and our calendar being a little different is because their calendar was a lunar calendar. They went by the moon. And that's different from us because we have a solar calendar. Solar calendar has about 30, like we have, a 30 to 31 typical day in a month. However, a lunar calendar, if I remember right, has closer to about 28 days in a month. So that's the reason why there's a little bit of overlap, and that's we see that mostly with Easter. That's why Easter fluctuates like it does, depending on how the moon falls, how the months break down for the Passover, and the lunar depends on if it's in March or April. Now, I saw that to say this is that what this basically tells us has been 3 months. For 3 months, Israel has been journeying. They've been traveling. Now, there's some discussion about what day of the month this is. Most people some think this is the first day. Some think it's maybe the second or third day. The reason for that being is because there was a feast later developed by the Israelites that on the 6th day of the 3rd month, they would have what they call a day of revelation, the day that God gave them the law. And there's some guidelines to that, and some people could see where that would fit in the pattern, because later God's going to tell 3 days. Well, if you we're not told exactly how many days it takes for God and Moses to tell everybody and figure out what everybody wants to do before he meets with them. There's a good possibility that date is right, that it's 6 days after this that they meet on the mountain. But I said all that again to show you that this is the new moon. That's the 3rd month. They've been out here for 3 months now, wandering in this land of wilderness, in this wilderness of sin, and now they have gotten out of the land of Egypt, and they have come to the wilderness of Sinai. Now, you'll notice 3 times in these 2 verses, it will tell us that Israel is in Sinai. And some people will say, well, why does it repeat itself so much? Well, it does it for emphasis. Number one, it tells us the general area of where they are. Notice the first verse, they came to the wilderness of Sinai. That was a very large place. Then again, the second part, they encamped in the wilderness. Again, not very specific. But then finally, in verse 3, it tells us they encamped before the mountain. They have journeyed here to the mountain of Sinai. And they have come here with Moses and being led by God. And they've come to Sinai. And this is the very, very interesting, very important part of this, is they are preparing to receive the law. They may not know that yet, but this is what's about to happen in Bible history. And so you notice in verse 2 and verse 3, Moses goes up to God. He goes up on the mountain where God is at. And God calls to him from the mountain. And he begins to speak to the people. Now notice again the repetition to show that this is who he's speaking of when he says, thus you say the house of Jacob, the people of Israel. That's 2 ways of describing the same people. He's basically saying, this is what you're going to tell these people. This is what you're going to tell the people I have led out, and I've led this specific group out, this specific people, for this very purpose. Verse 4, you yourselves, and again, God is speaking to Israel themselves and said, you have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, we've seen God talk about that before, that he has borne them out on eagle's wings. Again, the idea that he has delivered them mightily. He has delivered them completely. He has delivered them by his hand. And in delivering them, he had destroyed Egypt or took a few notches out of Egypt. And so God is saying, you've seen what I've done. You've seen how I brought you out. And then notice he said, not only how I brought you out, I brought you to myself. I brought you out to where I am, again, for this purpose. Now, again, you're going to notice that God's going to, he doesn't mention here, and I think it's very significant, he doesn't mention anything that Israel has done to earn this deliverance. Anything Israel has done to earn this salvation, the idea is they haven't done anything. There's nothing they could do to earn this salvation, that this is something God gave them, that God chose them to let them out. And notice again that God says, what I did. You know, we talk about sometimes in in regular talk, to talk about yourself and say what I did may be a bad thing if because we may think you're boasting, but God lays out very plainly for them, this is what he did. He wants, no doubt, that he's the one that brought them out. And then you notice he says in verse 5, now that you know that what I've done, you realize what I've done for you, how I've saved you, how I've delivered you out of no part of yours. This is what I want. And he sets up this covenant. He says, now if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, if you'll obey my voice and keep my law, keep this agreement. And then you notice he says, you will be my treasured possession among all peoples, for all the earth is mine. And that's a very interesting statement God makes, and that God says that he's choosing Israel above all of the nations. Again, God says, all the earth is mine. He could have chose any people he wanted to be. He could have chose any nation in history to have been his chosen people. But he chose Israel. And again, that's based not upon what Israel did, but really upon the promise God made all the way back in Genesis to Abraham. That promise of Abraham is what has brought them here. And then he tells them again, going back before we get too far in that, is if you'll hear my voice, if you'll listen, if you'll obey. One writer I was reading today in preparing for this mentioned that from Exodus 19 to Malachi, do you see God's interaction with the people is dealt with this idea that either they were being blessed for obeying God or they being cursed for cursing or disobeying God. And the sad reality is we're going to see that most of what we go as we progress the Old Testament, as most of us know, we're going to see Israel does more disobeying than they do obeying God. And so God says he chooses them. A very interesting thing he says in verse 6 is he says, you shall be to me a kingdom of priests. A royal priesthood is another way of putting that. That's very interesting because in Peter, Peter will talk about the church, Christians as being a royal priesthood. And some people will say, well, how can the Old Testament be a royal priesthood? How can they be those priests? Because there was a certain group, there was a certain tribe that was a priest. Well, the reason for that being is that God calls them to be priests, not in the idea that they would fulfill the role of a priest. And I think the next verse our next phrase enlightens this a little bit, in that they're going to be the role of a priest in the nation, in that they are going to be a mediator. The priest is a mediator between Israel, the Levite priests are a mediator between Israel and God. And what's basically is the entire nation of Israel is to be a mediator between God and the rest of the world. They're supposed to be this royal priesthood. And not only that, notice they're supposed to be a holy nation. A nation that is set apart, a nation that is different, a nation that's not worried about physical power, a large army, but whether or not they please God. The nation not worried about political power, but their servanthood. They're going to be a servant nation, or should be, and we're going to see that's part of Israel's problem. They never quite grasp God's plan for their nation, and so God tells Moses, "You take these words," and then the next part, "These are the words that you shall speak to the people of Israel." You take what I've just told you, you go back and you tell the people about this. And so Moses goes back and we see their reaction in verse 7. So Moses came and called the elders of the people and set before them all the words that the Lord had commanded him. All the people answered together and said, all that the Lord has spoken, we will do. And Moses reported the words to the people to the Lord. And the Lord said to Moses, behold, I'm coming to you in a thick cloud, that the people may hear when I speak with you, and may also believe you forever. So what happens is Moses goes up to the mountain to hear God. He comes off the mountain, speaks to the elders, and either he speaks to the elders in the hearing of all the people, or the elders go and speak to the people. We're not told exactly how this works out, but the rest of the people, all the people hear God's word. They hear what God just laid out. And basically God says, if you're willing, I will make a covenant with you. If you're willing, you will be my covenant people. You'll be that holy nation for me, and I'll bless you. And so verse 8, the people hear him. They hear what God has told Moses. They hear what God is offering. And they said, all that the Lord has spoken, we will do. So they say, we will accept the covenant. And in verse 8, this is sort of an interesting thing to me is I wonder if Moses may have got worn out from all the going back and forth. There's about 2 or 3 times Moses has to go up and down the mountain. The first time he goes up to hear God's word, he comes back down to the people and tells people what God said. The people say, yes, we'll follow, we'll do what God says. Now Moses has to take that word and go back up the mountain and talk to God. Now, again, he doesn't have to go back up because God already knew that. God knew what was happening, being omnipresent and all that he is. God knew that, but this was part of the technicality of covenant, if you will, in that you had a mediator. And a mediator would go between the two parties and he would work out a deal. And again, the idea of this covenant is typically you had two parties, about like a contract, or it is a contract, different form of contract. If you got a contract, you got two parties that are trying to make a deal, both parties present their bargaining, their offers. Well, we'll do this if they'll do that. And they say, oh, well, we'll do this if they'll do this too. You notice there's none of that back and forth here because God is the one with the upper hand. And that's why God says that I have brought you out. I have delivered you. I have given you all these things. Israel has no bargaining power. They either accept God's offer or they don't. And so that's what they say. And so Israel says, we'll take what God says. And then in verse 9, God speaks to Moses and he says, behold, I'm coming to you. I'm going to come down in a thick cloud. Now, remember, this is, again, the way God designates his presence. Later, when the tabernacle is built, he's going to descend the cloud upon the tabernacle to let Moses know when it's time for him to come talk to him. When he leads the people, he leads them in the cloud. The cloud is a very significant part of God showing his or God manifesting his presence in this role. So this is what he says. And God says, the people are going to come too. I'm going to come to you in a thick cloud. I'm going to speak to you, but I'm going to speak to you in such a way and in such a manner that all the people will hear you, or all the people will hear me. Now, it's interesting because God's spoken to Moses quite a bit before now, but we're never told that the people or God speaks when other people are around. Anybody else has heard Moses and God speaking. But here, God says, Moses, I'm going to speak so that the people will hear it. The people will hear when I speak to you. They'll hear me speak. And then the next second part of this, he says, not only will they hear me when I speak to you, but they will also believe you forever. Because there's no question anymore. There's no question of where's Moses getting this word from? Where's Moses getting these ideas? Where does Moses get this thought that he's talking to God? Well, they're going to hear God plainly. And it's a very interesting reaction to very interesting response to their hearing God in the next few chapters. But that's in chapter 21, I believe, that we'll see that. So Moses goes back in the middle of verse 9. It says, when Moses told the words of the Lord to the people, Moses told the words of the people to the Lord said to Moses, go to the people and consecrate them today and tomorrow, and let them wash their garments and be ready for the third day. For on the third day, the Lord will come down on Mount Sinai in the sight of all the people, and all shall set limits for the people, and you shall set limits for the people all around, saying, take care not to go up into the mountain or touch the edge of it. Whoever touches the mountain shall be put to death. No hand shall touch him, but he shall be stoned or shot, whether beast or man, he shall not live. When the trumpet sounds a long blast, they shall come up to the mountain. So Moses went down from the mountain to the people and consecrated the people, and they washed their garments. And he said to the people, be ready for the third day. Do not go near a woman. So notice Moses says he's up there with God. And again, you notice this is a sort of a continuation of what God had already said. When he says, I'm going to speak to, when he tells Moses, I'm going to come down in a cloud. I'm going to speak to you and they're going to hear me. But God says, before that happens, you've got to do something. Verse 10, go to the people and consecrate them. The idea of being consecrated is to be ceremoniously clean, to be pure, to be washed. And so God says, you're going to go down to the mountain, go down from me. You're going to consecrate the people, make them holy, have them be clean and do what they need to do. And you're going to have 3 days or 2 days to do this. You're going to do this today and tomorrow. Today and tomorrow, you're going to clean them, or you're going to consecrate them. You're going to do the right to make them pure. Then they're going to wash their garments. They're going to wash their clothes. Again, they're not like us. And this is something that's always been fascinating to me to think about ancient times and us. We get so used to washing our clothes and taking a bath every day. That wasn't the way it worked in the ancient world. It was a rare, it was not a common, or it happened every few weeks or so. You'd wash your clothes and you'd take a bath once a week. And that's sort of what Moses is doing here. The people are going to be constantly going to be clean. They're going to all take their bath. They're all going to wash their garments, and they're going to be ready on the third day. And on the third day, God says, I'm going to come down on Mount Sinai in the sight of all the people. Everybody's going to see this. Everybody's going to know what's going on. And God says to reinforce this idea, verse 12, you set limits around the people, for all the people. The idea is God's telling them to set up a almost like a fence. Exactly what it was, we don't know, but it's almost like a fence around the bottom of this mountain, a barrier, that a line that they would know they're not supposed to cross. And it would be that whenever if someone crossed that line, whether man or beast, they were to be put to death. If anybody touches the mountain that God is on, that God is on, when God is on it, they're going to be punishable by death. And so God lays this out for Moses. And again, God is very meticulous about this to make sure they obey this. Matter of fact, he's going to repeat this command in just a little bit later, that they're not to go into the mountain or touch the mountain. Don't come close to the mountain. And he says, whoever touches the mountain will be put to death. And then not only that, if someone touches the mountain, he says the other people are not supposed to touch that person. It's almost like a contagious disease or a contagious virus or like leprosy. They're not to touch him. Notice it says, verse 13, that he shall be stoned or shot. Basically, he's to be put to death at a distance, either stoning him by various people taking stones and stoning him with the stones, or various men taking up bows and arrows and piercing him and killing him that way. Basically, he's supposed to be put to death on the spot with no one touching him. And then he goes on to say, whether beast or man, he shall not live. No matter what it is. And again, the idea is that God is saying across this mountain to show the people how serious he is, how important of an event this is, and to make sure they know this. And again, this is another idea. They put this barrier around so that this was not by accident. Somebody went up on this mountain. They were going up there with a purpose. They were going up there because they knew they were going to touch the mountain. And then God says this will be the sign, verse 13, when the trumpet sounds, a long blast. There'll be a solid long blast, and that's going to be your cue. Everybody should come up to the mountain. Everybody's going to come gather around the mountain, and then you're going to come up on the mountain, is what God's speaking to Moses. And then verse 14, Moses makes that other trip back down the mountain. So Moses went down the mountain and constituted the people. He consecrated them. He cleaned them. They washed their garments. They did all the things they were supposed to do. They set themselves aside. There were certain things they're not supposed to touch. We'll find out later more about this process of being consecrated. But basically, the people were to be clean. And then verse 15. Verse 15 is very interesting because he says to the people, Moses speaks to the people, be ready for the third day. The third day is when God's coming back, and he says, do not go near a woman. Now, what this is this is talking about do not have sexual relations. The reason for that being is because we're going to see later on as we get into Leviticus that one of the things that would make someone ceremoniously unclean is a sexual relation. And again, we'll get to that point later, but this is why he says do not go near a woman, is not to have relations with her, because that's God is setting you aside. And they would set aside certain times when they were going to be clean. And again, this is to be consecrated. This was not I guess consecrated goes a little bit beyond just being clean or ceremonially clean. This was an extremely special spot they were going to do. And so they were not to be unclean in any way or any form. So we get to verse 16. On the morning of the third day, there were thunders and lightnings and a thick cloud on the mountain and a very loud trumpet blast, so that all the people in the camp trembled. Then Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet God, and they took their stand at the foot of the mountain. Now, this is a very powerful picture. I want you to try your best to catch this picture that Moses paints for us. It's the third day. The people have been told they're going to make a covenant with God. They've been told God is coming down and God's going to speak to Moses. All the people are to gather around the mountain. No one's to touch the mountain or they're going to be dead. And that morning, when they're getting ready, they're waiting for that trumpet blast to call. There's thunder. There's thunder. There's lightning. And a thick cloud descends upon this mountain. This has to be an amazing scene. To just see an awesome storm brewing, what it would look like. When God appears to Job, it's described as a storm. is the thunders, the lightning, the thick cloud. And then there's a very loud trumpet blast, that loud blast of summoning Moses. And again, the next part, so all the people of the camp trembled. The way that word trembled is used, it could be they were trembling because it was so loud, or it could be that it's so loud that it almost caused an earthquake, that the earth itself trembled and quaked. And again, just think about that for a minute, of what this must have been to hear this loud blast and then feel the earthquake beneath you. And so all the people come out to meet God. And as they come, God's not done yet. Verse 18, now Mount Sinai was wrapped in smoke because the Lord had descended on it in fire. The smoke of it went up like the smoke of a kiln, and the whole mountain trembled greatly. And as the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses spoke, and God answered him in the thunder. The Lord came down on Mount Sinai to the top of the mountain, and the Lord called Moses to the top of the mountain, and Moses went up. So here you have the thunder, the lightning, the cloud comes down upon the top of this mountain. The trumpet blast is causing people to tremble. Just an awesome sight. And then you have God descending on it with fire. And just some kind of awesome sign of fire comes down upon the mountain and sits on top of it. And this fire is so great that it creates this smoke. And then you have the thick cloud, and then you have the smoke that wraps around the mountain of Sinai. And it's a smoke that's very thick, that's very noticeable. And then you have the mountain itself trembles, it quakes. Again, that earthquake I was talking to you about earlier. And then the trumpets, that blast of the trumpet gets louder and louder. You can just imagine what this must have been like for the Israelites to be standing at this mountain and see God come down upon it, and to be in fear and trembling before God. And then finally, Moses speaks. Now, again, what did Moses say? We don't know. But Moses speaks, and God answers him in the thunder. God speaks to him, and it's probably talking about how God and Moses are going to interact in just a minute, that the voice of God speaking from this cloud was just like thunder. And so God comes down on top of the mountain, and God calls Moses. And God calls Moses. Moses, come up to the mountain. And Moses goes up to the mountain. God comes down, Moses goes up. What an awesome scene this has to be. And then you notice verse 21 to the end of the chapter. And the Lord said to Moses, go down and warn the people, lest they break through to the Lord to look, and many of them perish. Also let the priests who come near to the Lord consecrate themselves, let the Lord break out against them. And Moses said to the Lord, the people cannot come up to Mount Sinai, for you yourself warned us, saying, set limits around the mountain, and consecrate it. And the Lord said to Moses, go down and come up, bringing Aaron with you. But do not let the priests and the people break through to come up to the Lord, lest he break out against them. So Moses went down to the people and told them. So God calls Moses up on the mountain, and this is an interesting, again, trip. God comes up, God calls Moses. Moses goes up the mountain. What does God do? God says, go back down the mountain. Moses, you go back down to the bottom of the mountain, and you warn the people one more time. Warn the people, lest they break through. And again, the idea here, God is saying, you go through and warn them one last time to remind them not to let their curiosity get the best of them. Because notice, he says, let they break through to the Lord to look. They want to look at God. They want to see this God they serve. Remember, God's going to later, what we don't remember, but we're going to see later, God's going to tell Moses that if you look on my face, or no man can look on my face and live, you would die. And God says, go warn them one more time. Get any idea, any thought in their head out that they're going to want to come up here and look at me. Because if they do, they're going to be destroyed. And notice he says that many of them perish. And then again, he says, let the priests come near to the Lord. Or let the priests who come near the Lord consecrate themselves. Let the priests make sure they're doing what they need to be. Now this as a question of, well, wait a minute. It's not until a little later that the Levitical priesthood is established. What priest is God talking about here? Well, most people think that the priest here would have been some part of a family. Some people think it's probably the firstborn. Now, the firstborn would have been the ones who would offer the sacrifices to God. They'll be the ones that were the intermediaries between God and man, because this office of priest has not been established yet. So men have to offer sacrifices. Uh, Whoever they are, there's some kind of priest that was operating before God established the Levitical priesthood. And so God tells the priest, he says, make sure you're where you need to be too. Just because you're a priest doesn't make you any more powerful, any more special than the rest of them. And again, let the priests be warned that they had to be consecrated, lest the Lord break out against them. That coming before, and this is the idea that we're going to see throughout this next little part, is to come before God is not something to be taken lightly. To come before God, to offer sacrifices, to give sacrifice, is not something you do haphazardly. It's not something you do with just no thought or no concern. It is a very important, special place. Verse 23 is, I can relate to Moses here. Moses says, God, the people cannot come up here. You yourself has warned them not to come up here. He says, you've told me to set limits around the mountain. You've told me to set limits around this mountain and let them not come. He said, they're surely not going to come. But God's going to say, no, you're going to go back and tell them one more time. Why? Because God knows how Israel is. God has told Israel what to do, and Israel doesn't listen. Throughout the rest of history, God's going to tell Israel what to do. They don't always listen. So God tells Moses, you go warn the people one more time. And Moses says, no, they don't need to be warned. And God says, yeah, they do. And that's sort of the last two verses of this chapter, verse 24, where God tells Moses again, go down. Again, there's no arguing with God. There's no trying to change God's mind. God just tells Moses, go. I told you go back down, you go down. He says, we go down. And again, there's another purpose here. Remember, God wanted the people to hear him speak to Moses. So he spoke to Moses by himself. Now God says, you go back down to the people. You go down and you get Aaron to come with you. This is the first sign, the foreshadowing of what's about to happen. That Aaron is going to become the new high priest. Aaron's going to be the high priest of the Levites of the Levitical priesthood, who are going to be the high priests of Israel. And so Aaron's going to have a major part in what God does, or when God speaks to the people. And again, he says, but do not let the priests and the people break through to come up to the Lord, lest he break out against them. God again warns. He says, if they come up here, if they come on this mountain, he says, I'm going to destroy them. I'm going to defeat them. I'm going to wipe them out. Then verse 25, so Moses went down to the people and told them. Moses goes back down to the people, tells the people again, do not touch the mountain. Don't come near the mountain. As the priest, make sure you're consecrated. Make sure you're doing what you need to do before you come up on this mountain. And then we get Moses coming down the mountain, and that's going to lead us into our study for next week, which is to look at Exodus 19, or Exodus 20, excuse me. And Exodus 20 is going to be the 10 Commandments. Now, what's interesting about this is, sometimes we think about the 10 Commandments and we get this picture in our head of Moses on the mountain by himself and God giving him that handwritten tablet. Well, all the people are here when God gives 10 Commandments. God speaks the 10 Commandments, or 10 words is what they're called. God speaks them. And what's going to happen, I'm going to give you a little interesting thing about the next few chapters, is chapter 20, God's going to speak to the people. Chapter 21, the people are going, Moses is going to come down. They're going to have a feast to finalize the covenant, some things. We'll see that as we get there. And basically, when they're getting ready to finalize the covenant, the people come to Moses. And they basically tell Moses, God scares us. We don't like listening to God. We don't like hearing God speak out of that cloud. So here's what we want to do. We want you to go up to the mountain. God talks to you and you get the law, and then you come back down and tell us. And to me, when I read this encounter, that makes me see just how awesome, how powerful, how magnificent it had to be when God descended upon this mountain and God spoke to the people from this mountain. And God was taking control. That had to be an awesome thing to behold. An awesome thing that the people, 2 million people, were scared. They were afraid. They didn't want to listen to God. They didn't want out. They want to listen to God. They didn't want to hear God speak out of the thunder. They said, Moses, you go do it. What's interesting, too, is a Hebrew writer will reference this event in the latter part of Hebrews. I believe it's chapter 10, where he'll talk about us as the church. And he'll say, we didn't come to a mountain with trembling, but we have come to a mountain, the new Mount Sinai, the heavenly Jerusalem, with celebration, with joy, because our God is on the mountain. Our God is a God that makes this covenant. He makes the law, and he has saved his people. Because that's the idea of this mountain. This mountain, God's presence, was to show that God was saving his people. This was God's plan, God's layout of what he's going to do to save and redeem all of the nation of Israel. And then we have another mountain, a holy mountain we're to go to, a spiritual mountain, the mountain Jerusalem, where this same God resides. This same God lives. And the same God wants us to come and be a part of it, to come and not be afraid of him, but to live with him. It's always been an interesting thing to me about heaven is the idea that we live with God. But when God came down to these people, they were scared to death of him. But God gives us a promise of one day being at home with him in heaven. If we'll keep the covenant like they did, if we'll keep the law, the commandments, just as they did, that God will give us that home of heaven. That's the most interesting thing about to me in this passage, and we'll be done for 9, is the thought that God spoke to them from the mountain and scared them to death. But God wants us to come to this mountain as well. God wants us to come to the spiritual mountain of New Jerusalem, heavenly Jerusalem, and live with him. Not to be scared, not to be frightened, but to enjoy life with him. That's an amazing thought. That's an interesting thought to me. That God doesn't want us to be scared of. God doesn't want us to fear him and be afraid that we don't want to listen to him. But God wants to dwell with us because we're his people. He's our God. And he promises us that we'll one day see him face to face. This God that went to the mountain and said, nobody can come on this mountain unless they see me. Wants to see us face to face. To me, that just blows my mind to think about how much and how great we have it and where we live, when we live. That we have that hope of a heavenly Jerusalem with God, the heavenly Mount Sinai waiting for us, where we would dwell with God, with his angels, with his son, and with all those who've gone before. I thank you again for joining us tonight as we look at Exodus 19. Next week, Lord willing, we'll get to Exodus 20. And we'll talk about those 10 commandments, those 10 words God spoke from the mountain of Sinai. But for now, we hope that you're having a good week. Remember those we mentioned in our bulletin, also in our devotional. Remember those who have surgery. Remember those who've got treatments. Remember those in the hospital. Also remember that Sunday morning we meet at 10 a.m. We have our service here on Facebook and YouTube. Also remember that next Tuesday night at 7 p.m., we'll start back with our FBI class. So if you'd like to be a part of that, you can do that. That will be on Facebook and YouTube as well. But for tonight, we appreciate you joining us, appreciate you being here, and we hope that you have a God bless week, and we hope to see you all real soon.